I was not sure if I would enjoy this book when I bought it. I had found Anne Boleyn, the King's Obsession, a little dry the year before, and I had never read anything from the POV of Jane Seymour. I had always considered Jane the boring queen that nobody wanted to write about, but this book turned out to be a gripping read the whole way through. Jane Seymour came to life in my imagination. The book opens with Jane attending a feast in honour of her brother Edward's first marriage to Katherine Fillol. This gives us a good overview of Jane's big family. They seem very happy. Jane's father is the picture-perfect Tudor knight, and her mother is a domestic goddess. The young Jane is very happy and loves her big noisy family, but she is also very pious and wishes to become a nun, something her parents don't take seriously. Then the book skips forward 8 years to Jane spending a few weeks in a nunnery and finding out, to no one's surprise but her own, that she is not cut out to be a nun. During the 8 years that have passed, much has changed. Edward and Katherine have had 2 sons, but are deeply unhappy together, and Katherine seems to be suffering from postpartum depression. Jane's mother also seems unsettled, but Jane assumes she is suffering the menopause. Jane is unsure what to do with herself now. She is 19 and no longer wants to become a nun, but there are no suitors waiting in the wings to marry her either. Jane is questioning what to do with herself and considers going to court because her brothers seem very happy there, when her world implodes. The Seymour family discover that Katherine and Sir John, Jane's father, have been having an affair for 9 years, and Katherine's 2 sons are probably Sir John's. Katherine is immediately packed off to a convent, but the family are left unsettled and very unhappy, with huge rifts growing between Edward and his father. The family decide to keep quiet about the affair and pretend it never happened. By today's standard, the idea seems very crazy, but by Tudor standards, it's actually a sensible thing to do because nobody wanted a scandal. And the social ramifications of such a scandal. Jane is deeply sad for her mother and her nephews, or half-brothers, but wants to get away from her now unhappy home. She gratefully takes up a post at court as maid of honour to the Queen, but when she gets to court, she is amazed by the amount of gossip that goes on 100% of the time, and the petty jealousies among the maids of honour. This is the first book where you really get to see the life of a maid of honour. Anne Boleyn was never truly part of that world, holding herself aloof, and Katherine of Aragon was royal and never could have been a part of it. Jane makes friends very quickly and becomes best friends with a girl called Marjorie Horseman, but she also has an instant rival in the form of Nan Bassett. She is very homesick at the beginning of her time at court, but soon gets used to everything, and she loves Queen Katherine like a second mother. Jane quickly learns all the gossip about the king's great matter in Anne Boleyn, and takes the Queen's side, comparing the Queen's suffering in silence to Jane's own poor betrayed mother. Jane enjoys the court, but is a little hurt that no young men have come calling, apart from Francis Bryan, but she puts him off, knowing he has a very bad reputation with the ladies. I think Francis Bryan sounds quite sexy with his eye patch and his nickname, the Vicar of Hell, but I suppose it is a good thing Jane ultimately put him off, because he would have broken her heart. He never would have stayed loyal to her, and they were pretty close cousins, which makes the whole thing a bit gross. Since coming to court, Jane has learnt a lot about the religious reforms people want, and holds strong conservative views, but she keeps them to herself mostly, as she has been taught from childhood not to question the men around her. She is the complete opposite of Anne Boleyn, who was taught from childhood to question everything. Jane is finally settled at court when the sweating sickness breaks out and she is sent home, only to discover that her beloved younger sister Marjorie is dead, and so is her older brother Anthony. Jane and her family are in deep mourning, and throughout the rest of the book, Jane continues to think about Marjorie from time to time and miss her. Because of these losses, Jane develops a real fear of any plague, something we can all relate to during this time of COVID. When Jane finally gets back to court, she is angry Anne Boleyn survived the sweat when a sweet girl like her sister Marjorie died of it, and it makes Jane even stronger in her resolve to support Queen Katherine. The great matter is now being tried at the ecclesiastical court, and the Queen is summoned to the Blackfriars Monastery. Jane cannot attend the court, but she is on tenterhooks about what is going on there, and does every small thing she can to support Queen Katherine, who she views as a brave and righteous lady. Jane is worried England is being dragged into heresy by Anne Boleyn, and frets about the matter. She also worries about the Princess Mary. I believe Jane is far more aware than Katherine or Henry about how the divorce is affecting Mary. She knows from her own personal experience how a rift between parents can affect their children, and her care for Mary shines throughout the book, especially when she becomes queen later on. During this time, Jane introduces her brother Edward to Nan Bassett and lives to regret it because the two fall in love, much to Jane's horror, as Edward is still legally married to Katherine Fillol, and Nan Bassett is a sharp-tongued bitch. But after informing Edward of Nan's bitchiness, he makes her be a little kinder. The two women will never be close friends though, and Nan still makes the odd barbed comment, especially about Jane's looks, of which Jane is very sensitive, thinking herself too pale and too plain. Life continues though, with no news on the king's divorce, and no suitors for Jane. She now truly believes bitchy Nan Bassett that she is too plain. Then, to make matters worse, Jane's younger sister Lizzie is married before her, and even though Jane is happy for Lizzie, she is very jealous, and wants a family and children, and a man to love her. Jane continues to serve Queen Katherine faithfully, and follows her into exile, as Katherine moves further and further away from the court. She is a little bored, but doesn't mind because she loves the Queen so deeply. Jane has still no luck with love, however, and when a Venetian visitor flirts with her and pinches her bum, she has to laugh it off, saying it is the most interest any man has ever shown her. Jane's brothers, especially Thomas, are very annoyed that she is stubbornly serving Queen Katherine because they cannot see any good marriage prospects arising from this situation. Thomas gets Francis Bryan to arrange a marriage with William Dormer, but the whole thing falls apart before it can even get started because of politics, and it is very upsetting to Jane. She thinks William Dormer didn't like her because she is too plain, and I cannot help but feel sorry for Jane, as she torments herself over her looks and complexion. We have all been there at some point in our lives. Then the worst possible letter arrives. Jane's father is commanding her to leave Queen Katherine's service to serve Anne Boleyn, where her sister Lizzie is already serving as a maid of honour. Jane is upset and angry and complains bitterly to Queen Katherine before going quietly home to Wolf Hall to prepare to serve Anne Boleyn, the woman she considers a whore. While Jane is at home, she becomes very sick, with a fever, and has to recuperate for months. During the time of Jane's recovery, Anne is married, crowned, and gives birth to the Princess Elizabeth. Jane does not want to go to court, but is bullied by her family into going to serve the new Queen Anne. Jane is shocked when she sees Anne, because she looks older, and a lot more wary than the last time Jane had seen her. Jane is also scandalized by Anne's lack of queenly formality. Jane is obedient and quiet while at court, but is very happy to be reunited with her friend Marjorie Horseman, who is also serving as a maid of honour. The king notices Jane is back at court, and thanks her for a gift of embroidered handkerchiefs she gives him for Christmas. The king notices her again when she is the only maid brave enough to offer him any comfort after Anne's first miscarriage. Jane is worried about the religious upheaval in the world, especially Bishop Fisher and Thomas More's execution, and she wants to go home, but decides to stay because the king's next progress will go to Wolf Hall, and she will do nothing to jeopardize it, as it is a great honour to house the king. Jane's brothers are unbothered by the reforms, and to Jane's horror they actually agree with them. While on progress, Jane is present for an ugly incident where Anne accuses some monks of forging a religious relic of the blood of Jesus Christ by using the blood of some duck, as she puts it. Jane is horrified by the whole incident and believes Anne is making it up. When the court finally arrive at Wolf Hall, everything goes very well, apart from the fact Queen Anne clearly thinks Wolf Hall rustic and acts snobbily towards Jane's mother. It annoys Jane because she and her mother can trace their lineage back to Edward I, whereas Anne's grandparents were in trade. Jane reminds herself of her noble heritage and tries not to care about Anne's family's riches and their snobbery, but Anne's attitude towards Jane's beloved Wolf Hall hurts. This final snub by Anne makes Jane decide she wants to leave court. At this time the king is introspective. He still has no son and little hopes of one. He wanders out into the garden, where he finds Jane making up her mind to leave court. Henry remembers Jane's kindness to him at the loss of his and Anne's second child and unburdens himself to her. Jane listens sympathetically, unsure how to respond to the king, but he keeps talking to her, and when he finishes talking, he is looking at her with a new light in his eyes. After the conversation, Jane murmurs an excuse and goes to bed, unsure she can believe what has just happened. When she wakes, she is terrified the king will want to make her his mistress. She cannot do that to poor old Queen Katherine. She doesn't give Anne Boleyn a second thought. In Jane's mind, Anne is not Henry's true wife. She is nothing more than a concubine. The king continues to show an interest in Jane, and all she wants is for it to stop. She is attracted to him, but does not want to hurt Queen Katherine, or ruin her own reputation. She has found it hard enough to get a husband without the scandal of being the king's whore attached. When Jane tells her family that she wants to leave court because of the king's advances, they all get very excited, seeing her deposing Queen Anne and becoming queen. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas, are very eager at the prospect of royal favour. She thinks they are all being ridiculous and the king is just flirting a bit, but nevertheless her family make her stay at court. Even her mother sees the benefits of a royal flirtation. Jane is awkward with Henry. She is very attracted to him, but hates the thought of hurting Queen Katherine. She also worries about her good name. Hurting Anne Boleyn doesn't even come into it. The summer progress has ended, and people now know what is going on between Henry and Jane. Some of the courtiers are trying to carry favour with her, but other people, Anne Boleyn in particular, are being rude and cruel to her. Anne even throws things at her. Anne is pregnant again though, and riding high in the king's favour, so Jane is afraid to say anything about Anne's cruelty to anyone. Then Anne loses the baby, another boy, and is devastated. So is Henry, but Jane is truly compassionate because she feels sorry for Anne, despite the cruelties Anne has inflicted on her for months. This compassion is the reason so far in this series Jane is my favourite queen. Jane comforts Henry. She enjoys spending time with him, and though she will not agree to be his mistress, she agrees to be his friend. She listens to Henry's problems and soothes him, saying very little. Jane thinks a lot though, but judges it far wiser to hold her tongue. Jane Seymour the little mouse is much smarter than she looks. She truly is the complete opposite of Anne. Anne constantly speaks her mind. I think, more than anything, this showcases the differences between the way Jane and Anne were brought up. Anne was brought up around intelligent women who wielded power over men and were encouraged to think for themselves, whereas Jane was always told to keep her thoughts and opinions to herself, letting men take the lead. The different ways Anne and Jane act with Henry in private showcase this difference to the extreme. People at court know Jane has the king's favour, and she is approached by the Spanish ambassador and Richard Carew to intercede for Queen Katherine and Princess Mary. For the first time in Jane's life, she has some power that is wholly her own, but she is hesitant to use it, knowing that one slip of the tongue could make Henry angry. She is growing very fond of him, but knows in her heart that he can be cruel and ruthless, and it scares her. So Jane holds off speaking for Queen Katherine and Princess Mary. She also decides now is a bad time to speak for them because Anne is pregnant again. But then it is too late. Katherine has died, and Jane is truly saddened because she viewed Katherine as a second mother. Jane is appalled by Henry and Anne's lack of feeling, and disgusted by their rejoicing and wearing yellow. When Jane is told about the growth found on Katherine's heart by her brothers, she is convinced Anne Boleyn poisoned her. Jane is now very worried about the Princess Mary's safety, and decides to speak to Henry, but is discouraged to find that Henry believes Mary is a defiant child that must be brought to heel, and not simply a lonely child from a broken marriage and messy divorce. Jane continues to meet up with Henry though, and there is a bit of light petting going on at this stage, and Jane is growing to like Henry more and more. Then, just as things are looking rosy for Henry and Anne, Henry suffers that famous fall from his horse the day before Queen Katherine's funeral, and seeks comfort in Jane's arms. But they are caught red-handed by Anne Boleyn, with Jane sat on Henry's lap, with his hand on her breast. Anne flies into a jealous fury and miscarries yet another son. Jane feels very sorry for Anne in her bedchamber, weeping and wailing like a wounded animal. She thinks Anne does not have an enviable position, losing baby after baby, with the threat of divorce hanging over her. This is a rare moment of complete clarity for Jane, where she isn't yet completely head over heels in love with Henry, and realizes to some extent what she is getting herself into, and thinks that she would not want the Queen's position, because it is not an enviable one. Jane may feel sorry for Anne, but that doesn't stop her comforting a weeping Henry. Henry is in floods of tears, saying Anne can never give him a son and he should set her aside. Jane decides to bring up Mary Boleyn and the King and Anne's consanguinity, and Henry says he will have Archbishop Cranmer look into it. Henry is still very upset though, so Jane decides to comfort Henry with her body. She thinks acting kindly to him now will bind Henry closer to her in the future, so she goes to bed with him. Every time I read this scene, I am surprised by Jane's bravery in this situation. Henry could very easily sleep with her and then tire of her, like he did with Mary Boleyn. Jane rejoices in how natural their loving feels and how handsome Henry is. This is the main difference between Anne and Jane. Anne wanted a crown and cared nothing for the man who gave it to her, while Jane loves the man and sees the crown as a happy extra. Jane does want a crown, but it is more of an extra thought really. She wants Henry more. She even keeps his letters in her bodice next to her heart, whereas Anne always kept his letters in a box in her chamber. When Jane does think about becoming queen, it is mainly in the hopes of helping Princess Mary and restoring the old faith. Jane starts to worry a little that Henry will tire of her now that they have slept together, and that she could become pregnant. But she feels so loved by Henry, she thinks she is safe. She tells no one about them sleeping together, but her brother Edward lectures her constantly on morality and virtue. The king goes to Greenwich, leaving Queen Anne and Jane behind. Anne is even crueler than before, slapping and pinching Jane, and even rips a locket from Jane's neck, which holds Henry's picture. Jane is in very low spirits due to Anne's attacks, and missing Henry dreadfully. Then there comes that fateful letter in gold incident. Henry has sent Jane a letter and a large purse of gold publicly, which Jane sends back, saying it is not a suitable gift, but only because she remembers Edward's lectures on virtue. Inwardly, she wants to open the letter and keep the gold. This causes a lot of gossip about how the king is courting a virtuous woman, and Jane's brothers are convinced Jane is about to become queen. Jane is having a horrible time serving Queen Anne, who is continually rude and cruel to her. I like Jane a lot, but I think Anne's reaction to living with a woman who is trying to steal her husband was completely natural, even if it was excessively cruel. Then Anne moves to Greenwich to be with the king, and Jane is really excited to see Henry. But Henry completely ignores her, and Jane is devastated, convinced he has had her, and lost interest. A day and a half passes before Henry sends for Jane, and Henry has completely changed his mind about wanting a divorce, and is sleeping with Anne again. Jane is deeply saddened. She doesn't understand why Henry has said one thing and done another. Jane still loves Henry, but is very hurt by his actions and words. She still wants to be with him, though, and he is still an ardent swain, even if he is sleeping with Anne and Jane at the same time. This double-dipping behaviour makes me feel sick, especially for poor Anne, who had no idea it was going on. Henry is worried that Anne is treating Jane cruelly, so he gives Lord Cromwell's apartments to Edward and Nan. Lord Cromwell happily vacated them, so that Jane could lodge with Edward and Nan, and leave Anne Boleyn's service. Jane is thrilled to be away from Anne's cruel gibes, but is less happy at having to lodge with bitchy Nan Bassett, who is the queen of the veiled insult. Henry visits Jane in the apartments every other night, and they are left alone, so one thing leads to another and they are having lots of sex. Jane is still worried about getting pregnant and apprehensive about her future, because Henry has not mentioned divorcing Anne for months. Then Edward informs Jane he has attended a secret meeting with members of the old royal house and Lord Cromwell, who have all agreed Anne must be deposed, and Jane is to become queen in her place, and the Princess Mary is to be restored to the succession. Jane thinks they are all getting ahead of themselves, because Henry has not mentioned a divorce in months. Despite that, though, she can see her star rising at court. The court intrigues begin, and it is becoming clear the old royal family are taking a big interest in Jane, and she is convinced by them to speak against Anne to Henry. She doesn't want to hurt Anne, though. She imagines a quiet retirement somewhere in the country, where Anne can raise Elizabeth and disappear from view. The intrigues continue, and it is becoming clear that Cromwell and the old royal family want very different things out of the fall of Anne Boleyn. Jane tries to stay out of it, but becomes very upset when Eustace Chapuis acknowledges Anne as queen. Anne looks to be back in favour with the king, if he has finally made the Spanish ambassador acknowledge her. But then, a week or so later, Jane hears a rumour about the court that Anne has been unfaithful to the king, and starts to worry. She is questioned by Cromwell, and she fears that he is planning Anne's death. She doesn't want that on her conscience. She cannot believe that Anne has been unfaithful, because she is constantly attended. But then, while out in the park, Jane witnesses what she thinks is a tryst in the Tower of Mirefleur between Anne Boleyn and Henry Norris. She thinks Cromwell must be right. Even so, she cannot stand the idea of Anne's death. Jane is honestly a kind person, perhaps the kindest out of all of Henry's queens, especially now because she is pregnant and worried about her own future. Yet she still does not want to hurt Anne, the woman who tormented her for months. There is a lot of commotion in the court, and there has been a jury of peers called. Jane is freaked out and wonders if it is about Anne, but she doesn't have long to wait, as Henry comes to her that night to explain all. He is very angry and screaming that Anne has betrayed him with a low-born musician. Jane is even scared of him. Jane is completely horrified when Henry announces Anne will be burnt alive, and in the next breath asks Jane to marry him. Jane is dumbstruck by Henry's train of thought, from murder to marriage, but agrees to marry him on the condition that he doesn't burn Anne. Jane then tells Henry that she is pregnant, and he is overjoyed. Henry VIII and his mood swings. The whole scene is very emotional, and I think it shows that Henry was so wound up by Cromwell and his plotting that he was not thinking clearly at this time. The next day is the fateful May Day, where the world was turned upside down. Jane thinks how odd it is that Henry can act normally at the jousts, even loaning Norris his horse, but he leaves early, and after the jousts are over, Jane hears the cannon roaring, announcing that a person of high rank has entered the Tower of London. Jane is guilt-ridden over Anne's fate, and is happy when Henry asks her to leave court for propriety's sake. Out in the countryside, Jane is still feeling bad about Anne's fate, and missing Henry terribly. Her mood lightens slightly when her parents arrive, and she gets to tell them the happy news about her betrothal to the king. But her father looks sick, and she is very worried about him. They soon move to Chelsea at Henry's request, and Jane is happy to be nearer to him, but she is still worrying about Anne's fate, and when she realizes many of the common people think she is a whore, reveling in Anne's downfall, she is very hurt by it. The fact Jane is pregnant at this time makes her feel it even more acutely, and when her mother figures out she is pregnant, Jane cries. Lady Seymour is very understanding though, telling Jane everything is okay and that she will soon be married, but Jane is still sad the baby was conceived outside wedlock. Henry comes to visit Jane on 2 occasions, and both times gets very drunk, ranting loudly about Anne. This is the only time in the 6 Tudor Queen's books so far that we get to see Henry really drunk, and I feel it is a testament to how upset he is over what he thinks is Anne's betrayal. The day Anne is beheaded, Jane is picking out silks for her wedding dress, and she can't help but feel it is wrong somehow. This is the happiest moment of Jane's life, but it has been bought at the expense of somebody's actual life. I think this is a very good portrayal of human emotion, especially mixed emotion. A few days after Anne's execution, Jane and Henry are married, and Jane pushes all thoughts of Anne to the side and enjoys the day, but she is very upset that Henry will not consummate their marriage, because he is worried about hurting the baby. Jane never expected to spend her wedding night being as chaste as a virgin. Jane is very aware of her new rank, and resolves to put a distance between herself and her former friends and the maiden's daughter. Jane's actions come across all wrong though, and she appears cold and unapproachable, and she is very upset by this because she has hurt her friends, especially Marjorie Horseman, who is visibly upset at the Queen's coldness, as they were besties. This necessary severing of close friendships is one of the reasons I empathize with Jane's character. Have we all not experienced something similar? Even if it is just a simple moving apart. Then, only a few days after her wedding, after a day in the saddle, Jane loses the baby she is carrying. When her pains begin, she sees a shadow on the wall of a woman wearing a French hood, and it scares her, but Jane puts it to one side, thinking it is only a dream. Jane is deeply saddened by the loss of the baby, but resolved there will be more children, and the loss of the baby has convinced her to speak out for the Lady Mary, who the king is still very angry with for refusing to acknowledge him as the head of the church and her mother's marriage as unlawful. Jane brings up the subject of the Lady Mary in bed after sex with Henry, thinking he will be in a good mood and more likely to agree and forgive her. But he gets very angry, and Jane ends up getting herself raped for her trouble. She cries herself to sleep, and realizes this is a part of Henry she has never seen before. He can be cruel, and Jane realizes she hates this part of Henry's personality. But in true Jane Seymour style, she puts it behind her and decides to be positive because there are many other aspects of Henry she loves. The rape scene was disturbing and unexpected. This is the first time in this book series, actually the only time, that you see Henry be sexually violent towards a woman. I know Mary Boleyn in the 2nd book claims Henry raped her, but I think Mary is a slightly unreliable witness, especially because later on she is then very jealous of her sister Anne. I think Henry's change in behaviour is directly linked to how hurt he felt by Anne Boleyn's alleged infidelity. The Lady Mary finally capitulates, but not without everyone worrying Henry will have her executed, and Chapuis having to assure her God will forgive her for giving in. When Henry and Jane visit the Lady Mary, Jane is shocked by how sick and thin Mary appears. I am not surprised. The sort of stress the Lady Mary was under would be hard for a grown-up to bear, never mind a teenager. The Lady Mary is pathetically grateful that Jane is being kind to her, and Jane feels true sympathy for the girl, and she knows Henry is now feeling bad for how horribly he behaved towards her because he knows Mary has been truly unwell. They also visit the Lady Elizabeth, and Jane likes the smart little girl, but is distressed to discover Mary does not believe Elizabeth to be the king's child, even though she is the image of him. Jane thinks Mary is a little deranged for believing such a thing, especially when the king does not. I think this is very good foreshadowing for Mary's behaviour in other Alison Weir novels like The Lady Elizabeth and Innocent Traitor. I would really like Alison Weir to do a Mary Tudor book. She could call it something like The First Queen of England or Tudor Rose. I don't know, I just think a Mary Tudor book would be really good, as we never really get her perspective overly much. And I believe she is overly demonized. Not that she was overly nice, but perspective is everything. Jane attends a dinner hosted by her brother Edward and is unsettled by something Thomas Cromwell says, which is that he thought up the charges against Anne Boleyn. Jane is completely horrified by the idea that Anne was innocent and murdered on Jane's account. Jane goes back to Millefleur, the tower where she saw Anne and Norris, and feels a great sense of despair and hopelessness, and decides it is Anne and Norris's feelings about their hopeless love and bloody fate. I am not always a fan of magic or supernatural in books about historical fiction, but Alison Weir walks the line between reality and disbelief very well. Jane decides she can never truly trust Cromwell, and if he got rid of Anne, he could get rid of her. Jane decides to keep Cromwell sweet, because he is dangerous, a sensible move from a wise woman. People tend to overlook Jane as being one of the least political of Henry's queens, but I think she was very politically savvy and played it safe, a sensible move from a woman who had learnt from her predecessors. Then the Margaret Douglas-Edward Howard affair comes out, and Jane thinks Henry is ridiculously angry and overly cruel to the two lovebirds, which he is, but Jane comes to understand his anger is deeply rooted in his fears for this succession. Then Henry is grief-stricken by the death of his 16-year-old bastard son Henry Fitzroy, and all his fears for the succession seem manifold. His only possible heir, as he sees it, is Margaret Douglas, and in his words, she is the naughty girl in the tower. Jane can see how deeply upset Henry is, and she is upset because she is not conceived again, and that is the only true remedy to Henry's happiness. Jane is aware that Henry is wallowing in self-pity and overeating and gaining weight, and his leg ulcer is not healing. She decides to be forward and make him come to bed to conceive an heir, and that lifts his spirits because they are successful. They are both very happy about the new pregnancy, but there is an uprising in the north that quickly develops into the Pilgrimage of Grace. Jane is terrified of the rebels, even though she agrees with their views. She is convinced by Ambassador Chapuis to appeal to Henry publicly to reinstate the monasteries, and it is the worst possible move. Henry gives her a public dressing down, telling her to remember what happened to Anne Boleyn, and not to meddle in his affairs of state. Jane is heartbroken, but Henry apologizes privately and tells her to stay out of politics, and she agrees, seeing it as a sensible move. Christmas is fast approaching, and the Lady Mary is received back at court for the first time. She is obviously very nervous and faints at the meeting. Jane marvels at the fact that Henry cannot see that his daughter's nerve problems are his own fault, not the dead Anne Boleyn's. Jane knows a husband and children would make Mary much happier, but Henry is adamant that he will only let Mary marry once he has a male heir, and Mary is convinced that nobody will want her due to her bastard status when Jane broaches the subject with her. I think Jane empathizes with Mary here because for a long time Jane felt unwanted by men and blamed her looks, whereas Mary now blames her new status as a bastard. Henry is very excited about Jane's new pregnancy and points it out publicly at a feast, but then Jane miscarries, and again, right before her pains begin, Jane sees the shadow of a woman wearing a French hood on the wall, and thinks it looks even more like Anne Boleyn. She scares herself into thinking Anne has come to take away her son. Jane and Henry are both very upset by the miscarriage, and Henry is wondering yet again why he cannot seem to have any male children. The rebels are still advancing and have taken York. Unable to muster a big enough force of an army, Henry decides to dissemble and invites the rebel leader Robert Aske to court. Jane likes Robert Aske and agrees with many of his principles privately, but Jane doesn't like the way Henry is behaving with Aske. She thinks her husband can be very two-faced, and knows from her last appeal not to question Henry's political decisions. Henry and Jane have a lovely Christmas, with both the Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth at court, and Jane becomes pregnant again. Henry goes into overdrive trying to keep Jane and the pregnancy safe. Jane is living in fear of the shadow of Anne appearing on her bedroom wall. During this time, Jane agrees to her sister Lizzie marrying Cromwell's heir Gregory. She is worried about losing this baby and scared of Cromwell, and she wants him tied to her by marriage because she remembers the downfall of Anne Boleyn all too clearly. Henry keeps all rebellion news away from Jane, and she finds out through court gossip that Robert Aske has been hanged in chains for treason, and she is deeply upset by this news because she thought he was a good man. Then, as Jane's pregnancy advances, Jane's father, Sir John, dies, and Jane is unable to attend his funeral because she is queen, which is very upsetting. I feel very sorry for Jane here because the court does not even wear mourning for her father. Then Jane goes into confinement, and though her labour is long, she is successfully delivered of a prince. The most touching thing about this whole scene is that Jane asks Henry to stay with her after the baby's birth, and they all fall asleep together in the same bed. It is so cute and lovely, it makes what is about to happen all the sadder. Jane feels well and is annoyed the midwife will only let her eat broth. Hungry for something more substantial, she orders food from the kitchen, and then writes letters proclaiming the birth of her son, feeling very happy with herself, as she should. She has managed to do something not even a princess of Spain could do. Jane is unbelievably proud when her son is christened, and her and Henry are fully united in their joy. Then Jane starts getting stomach pains and becomes violently ill, and she thinks she has food poisoning, but her hands and feet are tingling. It seems to pass, but then comes back more violently, and she is now finding it painful to breathe. The king is very worried and summons his own doctors, but Jane realizes with horror they do not know what is wrong with her. Breathing is becoming harder and harder, and then Jane sees that shadow on the wall, and it is unmistakably Anne Boleyn beckoning to her, and Jane knows she will die. It has also become obvious to everyone else that Jane is dying, and Henry is in floods of tears, cursing himself for not being able to save her. The Lady Mary is there too, crying, and so is Cromwell. But Jane feels like she is in a dream and cannot focus on anyone. Her last words are to see her son to bless him, but when they finally bring the boy to her, she does not have the strength to speak. So she blesses him in her heart and hopes that blessing will last an entire lifetime. And she tries to focus on his sweet face as she slips away. Every time I read this last line, I want to cry. It is so beautiful and painful and just sad. I give this book 10 out of 10. It is beautifully written and gives a character to the most forgotten of Henry's queens. This is the end of the Jane Seymour, The Haunted Queen book review. If you enjoyed this book review, please like, comment and subscribe so you will not miss the next book in this series, which is Anna of Cliffa, Queen of Secrets, which will be with you very soon. You can also follow me on Instagram at Lady Jessica Riddell. Until next time, remember we are all bound to obey and serve.